The old wooden door of Miller's trading post slammed open so hard it rattled the jars of pickles on the shelves. Everyone inside turned to look at the boy who had just burst through. He couldn't have been more than 14, with dirt streaked across his face and his clothes soaked from the rain. His chest was rising and falling like he'd been running for miles. "Please," the boy gasped, looking around at the faces staring at him. "I need help. My sister is dying." Old Miller wiped his hands on his apron and walked over to the boy. The trading post had been his family's business for 30 years, and he'd seen plenty of desperate folks come through those doors. But something about this kid's eyes made him stop what he was doing. "Slow down, son," Miller said gently. "What's your name?" "I'm Danny," the boy said, still trying to catch his breath. "Danny Walsh. Our wagon train got stuck at Devil's Crossing. The river flooded real bad from all this rain. We can't get across, and my sister Grace, she's real sick. She's burning up with fever and Ma doesn't know what to do." The other customers in the store started whispering among themselves. Devil's Crossing had a reputation. It was the most dangerous river crossing for miles around, especially during spring floods. Many a wagon train had gotten stuck there and not all of them made it out. "How long has she been sick?" asked Mrs. Peterson, the schoolteacher. She had kind eyes behind her wire-rimmed glasses. 3 days now," Danny replied. "Started with just a little cut on her hand from fixing the wagon wheel. But then it got all red and swollen. Now she's talking crazy things and won't wake up proper. Pa says we need a real doctor. But the closest one is in Millfield, and that's 3 towns away." Miller shook his head sadly. "Son, even if we could get word to Millfield, it would take days for a doctor to reach you. And with the roads washed out from all this rain..." Danny's face crumpled. He'd ridden hard for 6 hours to get to the trading post, hoping against hope that someone could help. His sister Grace had always taken care of him when their parents were busy with the farm work. She was the one who taught him to read, who bandaged his cuts when he fell out of trees, who made sure he had enough to eat even when times were tough. "Wait a minute," spoke up Jake Morrison, a grizzled old trapper who was buying supplies in the corner. There might be someone who could help. Everyone turned to look at Jake. He was known for his tall tales, but he also knew these mountains better than anyone. "You talking about the mountain man?" Miller asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake nodded. "Goes by Tom. Lives up in the high country, about a day's hard ride from here. Used to be a soldier, they say. Saw plenty of fighting in the war. Word is he knows about doctoring too." Danny's eyes lit up with hope. "You think he could help my sister?" Jake scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well, he might. If you could convince him to come down from his mountain. Problem is, he don't like visitors much. Keeps to himself up there. Some folks say he's touched in the head from the war. Others say he's just tired of dealing with people." "I'll go talk to him," Danny said immediately. "I'll ride up there right now." "Hold on there, boy," Jake said, holding up a hand. "It ain't that simple. Tom's place is hard to find, and the trail's dangerous even in good weather. With all this rain, it'll be near impossible. Plus, he might just run you off with a shotgun before you even get a chance to explain." Danny's shoulders slumped, but only for a moment. Then he straightened up again, that determined look back in his eyes. "I don't care. My sister's dying. I have to try something." Miller looked at the boy with admiration. He reminded him of his own son at that age before the fever took him. "Jake, you know these mountains. Could you guide the boy up there?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying Danny's face. Finally, he sighed. "I reckon I could. But Tom might not even be there. He comes and goes as he pleases. And even if we find him, there's no guarantee he'll help." "I have to try," Danny repeated. "Please, mister. Grace is all the family I got besides. Ma and Pa, I can't just let her die, something." In the boy's voice touched everyone in that little trading post. Mrs. Peterson reached into her purse and pulled out a few coins. "Here, take this. You might need supplies." Other customers started digging into their pockets too. Soon there was a small pile of money on Miller's counter, along with some jerky hardtack and a rain slicker. Jake looked at all the donated supplies and shook his head with a slight smile. "Well, I guess we're doing this then. But we leave right now while there's still daylight. And boy, you better prepare yourself for disappointment. This mountain man, he's not like regular folk." Danny nodded eagerly. "I don't care what he's like as long as he can help Grace." As they prepared to leave, Miller pulled Jake aside. "You really think this Tom fellow will help?" Jake shrugged. "Hard to say. I've seen him in town maybe twice in 5 years. Both times he was buying medical supplies along with his regular goods. Salt, bandages, laudanum, things like that. Makes you wonder what he needs them for up there in the mountains all by himself. Maybe he's been helping folks all along, and we just don't know about it, Mrs. Peterson suggested. Maybe, Jake said. Or maybe he's just patching up his own wounds from living rough. Either way, it's the boy's only chance. Danny climbed onto his tired horse, determination written all over his young face. The animal was exhausted from the hard ride to town, but it would have to carry him a little further. Jake mounted his own sturdy mountain pony, a sure-footed beast used to difficult trails. "One more thing, boy," Jake said as they prepared to ride out. "If we do find Tom, you let me do the talking at first. He's more likely to listen to someone he's seen before. And whatever you do, don't take it personal if he says no right off. Sometimes a man needs time to think things over." Danny nodded, though inside he was already planning what he would say to convince this mysterious mountain man to help his sister. He would beg if he had to. He would promise anything. Grace had always told him that family was the most important thing in the world, and family never gave up on each other. As they rode out of town into the gray afternoon, the rain started falling harder. The trail ahead would be treacherous, and there was no guarantee they would even find the man they were looking for. But Danny didn't care about any of that. All he could think about was his sister's fever-bright eyes and the way she'd whispered his name that morning, like it took all her strength just to speak. He was going to save her, no matter what it took. Tom was chopping wood behind his cabin when he heard the horses coming up the mountain trail. The sound made him freeze, axe halfway through a thick pine log. Nobody came up here. That was the whole point of living this far from civilization. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and listened carefully. 2 horses moving slow and careful on the wet rocks. Whoever it was knew something about mountain riding, or they'd have fallen off the trail by now. Tom set down his axe and walked to the corner of his cabin where he kept his rifle. The cabin sat on a small flat area carved out of the mountainside, surrounded by tall pine trees. Tom had built it himself 5 years ago, after he couldn't stand living around people anymore. Up here, the only sounds were wind in the trees, birds calling, and the distant rush of the creek that ran down from the high peaks. He peered around the corner of the cabin and saw 2 riders approaching. One was Jake Morrison, the old trapper he'd seen a few times in town. The other was just a kid, soaked to the skin and looking half dead from exhaustion. Tom stepped out from behind the cabin, rifle in his hands but not pointed at anyone. "That's far enough," he called out. "What do you want?" Jake raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy there, Tom. We need to talk to you. It's important." "Nothing's important enough to bring you up here in weather like this," Tom replied. His voice was rough from not talking to anyone for weeks at a time. The boy slid down from his horse and took a step forward. Tom could see he was shaking, and not just from the cold rain. "Please, mister. My sister's dying. They said you might know about doctoring." Tom's grip tightened on his rifle. He didn't want to hear about dying sisters. He'd had enough of death to last him several lifetimes. "You got the wrong man. I don't doctor nobody. But you were a soldier." The boy pressed on, desperation clear in his voice. "You must know something about fixing people up. Being a soldier don't make you a doctor, boy. It just teaches you different ways to hurt folks." Tom's voice was hard, but Jake noticed he hadn't told them to leave yet. Jake climbed down from his horse and walked closer. "Tom, I know you like to keep to yourself and I respect that, but this kid rode 6 hours through flooding rain just to find you. His sister's got blood poisoning from an infected cut. Without help, she'll be dead before morning." Tom turned away from them and stared out at the gray sky. Blood poisoning. He'd seen plenty of that during the war. Good men dying not from bullets or cannon fire, but from tiny cuts that went bad. It was a cruel way to go, burning up from the inside while your family watched helplessly. "There's doctors in Millfield," he said finally. "Send for one of them." "Can't," Danny spoke up, his voice cracking. "The roads are all washed out. And even if they weren't, it would take too long. She don't have that kind of time." Tom closed his eyes and tried to push away the memories that were starting to surface. Other young voices begging him to save brothers and friends and lovers. The weight of those failures pressed down on his chest like a stone. "I ain't a doctor," he repeated. "I'm just a man who wants to be left alone." "My sister, Grace, she's only 22, Danny continued, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "She takes care of our whole family. Ma's been sickly since the baby died. and Pa works himself to death trying to keep the farm going. Grace is the one who keeps us all together. Without her, Tom turned back to look at the boy. He saw something in those young eyes that reminded him of his own reflection from years past. The desperate need to save someone you loved even when it seemed impossible. Where's she at? Tom asked quietly. Devil's Crossing, Jake answered. Wagon train got stuck when the river flooded. They're camped on the south side, can't get across to higher ground. Tom cursed under his breath. Devil's Crossing was dangerous even in good weather. With the spring floods, it would be a death trap. And if the girl had blood poisoning, being stuck in a damp, cold camp would only make things worse. How long since the infection started? Tom asked, and Danny's face lit up with hope at the question. 3 days. Started small, but now her whole arm's swollen and she's burning up with fever. She keeps talking about things that ain't there. Tom knew what that meant. The poison was spreading through her blood, affecting her mind. She was in the final stages. Even with proper medical care, her chances weren't good. Out there in a wagon camp with no real supplies or clean conditions, she was as good as dead. But Tom also knew that sometimes, just sometimes, you could pull someone back from that edge. He'd seen it happen during the war. Not often, but enough times to know it was possible. He looked at his cabin, at the peaceful life he'd built for himself up here in the mountains. No responsibilities, no one counting on him. No chances to fail people who trusted him. It was lonely, but it was safe. Then he looked at Danny, this kid who'd ridden through a storm and climbed a dangerous mountain trail just for the chance that a stranger might help save his sister. The kind of loyalty and love that Tom used to believe in, before the war showed him how cruel the world could be. I got medical supplies, Tom said slowly. Not much, but some. Laudanum for pain, carbolic acid to clean wounds, bandages. Might be enough if she ain't too far gone. Danny's whole face changed. You'll come? You'll help her? Tom held up a hand. I ain't promising nothing, boy. Blood poisoning's a hard thing to fight, and getting to Devil's Crossing in weather like this, that's a whole other problem. But you'll try? Danny pressed. Tom looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. Road down to the crossing's probably washed out in places, Jake said. But I know some back trails. It'll be rough going, but we can make it. Tom was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with himself. Every instinct told him to send these people away and go back to his simple, isolated life. He'd tried to save people before, and most of the time he'd failed. Each failure had carved another piece out of his soul until there wasn't much left. But looking at this desperate kid, Tom realized something. Maybe the reason he'd kept all those medical supplies wasn't really for himself. Maybe deep down he'd always known that someday someone would need his help, someone who had nowhere else to turn. All right, Tom said finally. Give me 10 minutes to pack my gear. But I'm warning you both right now, I can't work miracles. If she's too far gone, there ain't nothing I can do about it. Danny practically collapsed with relief. Thank you. Thank you so much. Tom was already moving toward his cabin. Don't thank me yet, boy. We got a long, hard ride ahead of us, and no guarantee your sister will still be breathing when we get there. Save your thanks for if she lives through this. As Tom gathered his medical supplies and saddled his horse, he tried not to think about what he was doing. He was breaking his own rules, leaving his safe mountain retreat to get involved in other people's troubles. But as he tied his saddlebags tight and checked his rifle one more time, Tom realized he was more awake and focused than he'd felt in years. Maybe it was time to find out if he still had what it took to save a life. The rain had turned from a steady downpour into something much worse. It came down in sheets now, driven by wind that made the trees bend and creak like they might snap at any moment. Tom pulled his hat down low and squinted through the darkness, trying to follow the narrow trail that wound down the mountainside. Behind him, he could hear Danny's horse struggling to keep its footing on the slippery rocks. The boy had barely said a word since they'd left Tom's cabin 2 hours ago. He was probably scared, Tom figured, and he had every right to be. This trail was dangerous enough in daylight and good weather. In a storm like this, one wrong step would send horse and rider tumbling down a 100-foot drop. How much further? Danny called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. Hard to say, Tom shouted back. At this pace, maybe 6 more hours if we're lucky. 6 hours. Tom did the math in his head. It would be nearly dawn by the time they reached Devil's Crossing. Would the girl still be alive by then? Blood poisoning moved fast, especially in someone young and previously healthy. The fever would keep climbing until it either broke or killed her. Without proper medicine and care, Tom knew which outcome was more likely. Jake was leading the way, his mountain pony picking its way carefully down the treacherous path. The old trapper knew these trails better than anyone, but even he was having trouble in conditions like this. Twice already they'd had to backtrack when rock slides had blocked their route. Tom's horse stumbled, and for a heart-stopping moment he thought they were going over the edge. But the sure-footed animal recovered, finding solid ground again. Tom patted its neck gratefully. He'd bought this horse from a cavalry unit 5 years ago, and it had never let him down. As they descended, the air grew warmer, but the rain got heavier. Tom could hear rushing water somewhere below them, probably one of the many creeks that fed into the main river. All that water had to go somewhere, and most of it was heading toward Devil's Crossing. "Tom!" Jake's voice carried back through the storm. "Trail's washed out ahead. We're going to have to go around." Tom cursed under his breath. Every detour meant more time, and time was something they couldn't afford. But there was no choice. They couldn't fly over the washout. Jake led them off the main trail onto what was barely more than a game path. It was even steeper and more treacherous, winding through thick forest where the trees grew so close together that their branches formed a canopy overhead. At least it gave them some shelter from the driving rain. Danny's horse slipped and nearly went down. The boy managed to stay in the saddle, but Tom could see he was reaching the end of his strength. He'd been riding hard for almost 8 hours now, and the strain was showing. "You holding up back there?" Tom called out. "I'm fine," Danny replied, but his voice was shaky. "Just keep going." Tom admired the kid's determination, even as he worried about him. Danny reminded Tom of himself at that age, before the war had beaten all the optimism out of him. Back when he still believed that wanting something badly enough could make it happen. They rode in silence for another hour, focusing all their attention on not falling off the narrow trail. The sound of rushing water was getting louder, which meant they were approaching the valley floor where Devil's Crossing waited. "There's something you need to know," Tom called out to Danny during a brief lull in the wind, "about what we might find when we get to your sister." "What do you mean?" Danny asked. "Blood poisoning changes people. The fever makes them see things that aren't there, say things that don't make sense. She might not recognize you right away. She might fight us when we try to help her." Danny was quiet for a moment. "She'll know me," he said finally. "Grace always knows me." Tom hoped the boy was right, but he'd seen too many good people lost to fever dreams to be confident. Still, he didn't have the heart to crush Danny's faith. The kid would find out soon enough what they were dealing with. As they worked their way down the mountain, Tom found himself thinking about his own sister, Lucy. She'd been dead for 10 years now, taken by the same fever that had swept through their town the winter before he left for the war. He'd been powerless to help her then, just as he'd been powerless to help so many others since. But maybe this time would be different. Maybe this was his chance to finally save someone who mattered to a person who loved them the way Danny loved Grace. The trail finally leveled out, and they found themselves riding through flooded bottomland. Their horses splashed through water that came up to their bellies, and Tom could see debris floating past, tree branches, pieces of buildings, even what looked like part of a wagon wheel. "The river's really up," Jake observed grimly. "Worse than I've seen it in 20 years. They pushed on through the flood, their horses struggling against the current. Tom could see lights ahead now, flickering through the rain. The wagon train camp at Devil's Crossing. As they got closer, Tom could make out the shapes of covered wagons arranged in a rough circle. Most of them were sitting in several inches of water. People moved between the wagons carrying lanterns, and Tom could hear voices calling out orders and questions. "There." Danny pointed toward one of the wagons at the far end of the circle. "That's ours." They splashed toward the wagon, and Tom could see people coming out to meet them. A man with graying hair and worry lines etched deep in his face stepped forward. "This had to be Danny's father. Danny!" the man called out. "Thank God you made it back. Did you find help?" "This is Tom," Danny said, sliding down from his exhausted horse. "He used to be a soldier. He knows about doctoring." Tom dismounted and looked around the camp. The situation was worse than he'd expected. The wagons were sitting in standing water, and he could smell the sickness that came with poor sanitation and too many people crowded together in wet conditions. Several people were coughing, and he could see the pale faces of fever victims in more than one wagon. "How's Grace?" Danny asked his father urgently. The older man's face fell. "Not good, son. Not good at all. She's been asking for you, but she's not making much sense." The fevers got her real bad. Tom grabbed his medical bag from his saddlebags and followed Danny toward their wagon. As they walked, he could hear other people in the camp whispering about the mountain man who'd come down from his hideout to help. Some sounded hopeful, others skeptical. At the wagon, a woman with gray hair and red-rimmed eyes poked her head out. Danny's mother, Tom realized. She looked like she'd been crying for days. "Ma, this is Tom," Danny said. "He's here to help Grace." The woman looked at Tom with desperate hope in her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "She's all I got left. My other children. The fever took them years ago. Grace is the only one who survived. I can't lose her too." Tom felt the familiar weight of other people's expectations settling on his shoulders. They were counting on him to work a miracle, to bring their daughter back from the edge of death. He'd disappointed so many families before. What made this time any different? But as he climbed into the wagon and saw Grace lying on a pile of blankets burning with fever and barely conscious, Tom pushed aside his doubts. This girl was somebody's whole world, just like Lucy had been his. Maybe he couldn't change the past, but he could try to change what happened next. "I'm going to need clean water, lots of it," Tom said, rolling up his sleeves. "And more light. And everyone needs to stay calm and do exactly what I tell them." He opened his medical bag and began to assess what he was dealing with. The girl's condition was critical, but she was still breathing. She was still fighting, and as long as she was fighting, Tom would fight alongside her. The inside of the wagon smelled like death and desperation. Tom had smelled it before, in field hospitals during the war, in the homes of families struck by fever. It was the smell of a body losing its battle against infection. Grace lay on a makeshift bed of blankets and clothing, her dark hair plastered to her head with sweat. Her face was flushed red with fever, and her breathing came in short, rapid gasps. Tom knelt beside her and placed his hand on her forehead. She was burning up. "How long has she been like this?" Tom asked Danny's mother, whose name he learned was Ruth. "2 days now," Ruth whispered, wringing her hands. "The fever started yesterday morning and it's just been getting worse. She keeps talking to people who aren't there, calling out names of folks who died years ago." Tom nodded grimly. He'd expected as much. The infection had reached her bloodstream and was affecting her brain. In his experience, once the fever dreams started, there wasn't much time left. He gently took Grace's hand to examine the wound that had started it all. Her entire left arm was swollen and red with angry streaks running up toward her shoulder. The original cut on her palm had turned into an open sore that oozed yellow pus. The smell made Tom's stomach turn. "Danny, I need you to hold this lantern steady," Tom said, opening his medical bag. "And Ruth, can you heat some water? As hot as you can get it." "Will she be all right?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked at the boy's face, so full of hope and fear. He wanted to lie, to give some comfort, but lies wouldn't help anyone right now. "I don't know, son. She's real sick, but we're going to do everything we can." Tom began laying out his supplies. Carbolic acid to clean the wound, laudanum for the pain, clean bandages, a sharp knife for cutting away the infected tissue. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Grace stirred and opened her eyes, looking around wildly. "Mama," she whispered. "Mama, where are the babies?" "I can hear them crying." Ruth started to cry softly. She's been talking about her little brothers and sisters who died from fever 5 years back. Sometimes she thinks they're still alive. Tom had seen this before too. The fever made people retreat into memories, often happier times when their loved ones were still with them. In a way, it was merciful, but it also meant that Grace was slipping further away from the present, further away from them. "Grace," Tom said gently, taking her good hand. "My name is Tom. I'm here to help you." She turned her fever-bright eyes toward him, and for a moment they seemed to focus. "Are you the doctor?" Danny said he was going to find a doctor. "Something like that," Tom replied. "I'm going to take care of that cut on your hand, all right? It's going to hurt some, but we need to clean it out." Grace nodded weakly, then closed her eyes again. Tom looked at Danny and Ruth. "I need to clean this wound properly, and it's going to be painful. She might scream or fight me. I need you both to hold her still no matter what." Danny swallowed hard but nodded. Ruth placed a wooden spoon between Grace's teeth to keep her from biting her tongue. Tom poured carbolic acid over his knife and hands, then began the delicate work of cutting away the infected tissue. Grace's eyes flew open and she tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by the wooden spoon. Her whole body went rigid with pain. "Hold her," Tom commanded as Grace began to thrash. Danny and Ruth gripped her shoulders while Tom worked as quickly as he could. He had to cut deep to get all the infection out, and each cut brought fresh blood and more pain. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Tom had removed all the infected tissue he could see. He poured more carbolic acid directly into the wound, which made Grace convulse with pain even though she was barely conscious. "The worst part's over," Tom said, beginning to bandage the cleaned wound. "Now we wait and see if the infection stops spreading." But even as he said it, Tom could see that the red streaks on her arm hadn't gotten any smaller. The poison was still moving through her bloodstream, and cleaning the wound might not be enough to stop it. Grace was shivering now despite her fever, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Tom had seen this before too. Her body was starting to shut down, preparing for death. "We need to get her fever down," Tom said. "Ruth, bring me all the cool water you can find. Danny, help me get these wet clothes off her. We need to cool her body down fast." They worked together in the cramped wagon, stripping Grace down to her undergarments and wrapping her in wet sheets. The cool water seemed to help a little. Her shivering eased and her breathing became slightly less labored. But Tom knew they were just buying time. Unless her body could fight off the infection on its own, all their efforts would only delay the inevitable. He'd seen strong men die from blood poisoning despite the best medical care available. A young woman weakened by days of fever had even less chance. "Is there anything else you can do?" Ruth asked, reading the worry in Tom's face. Tom looked at his remaining supplies. He had laudanum for pain, but that would only make her more comfortable as she died. He had some willow bark tea that might help with the fever, but probably not enough to make a real difference. Then he remembered something from the war. An old army surgeon had told him about a treatment that sometimes worked when everything else failed. It was dangerous and painful, but for someone who was dying anyway, it might be worth the risk. "There's one more thing I can try," Tom said slowly, "but it's risky, and it's going to hurt her more than anything we've done so far." "What is it?" Danny asked. "I can try to draw the poison out by making cuts along those red streaks on her arm. Sometimes if you can get the infected blood to drain out, the body can heal itself. But if I cut too deep or if her heart's too weak..." He didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. The treatment itself could kill her. Ruth looked at her daughter's pale, fever-flushed face. Grace was breathing so shallow now that Tom had to watch carefully to see her chest rise and fall. "She's dying anyway, isn't she?" Ruth asked quietly. Tom nodded. "Without something drastic, she probably won't last the night." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Then she looked up at Tom with determination in her eyes. "Do it. If there's even a chance it might save her, do it." Tom picked up his knife again and sterilized it with carbolic acid. His hands were steady, but inside he was trembling. He'd tried this procedure exactly twice during the war. One patient had died on the table. The other had lived, but barely. "Danny, I need you to hold that lantern right here," Tom said, positioning the boy where the light would be best. "And Ruth, you hold her shoulders again. This is going to be the hardest part." As Tom made the first small cut along the red streak on Grace's arm, she convulsed and let out a weak cry. Dark, foul-smelling blood began to ooze from the cut, and Tom felt a spark of hope. The infection was draining out, which meant there was still a chance. He made another cut, then another, following the path of infection up her arm. Each cut released more poisoned blood, but also caused Grace more pain. By the time he was finished, she had passed out completely from the trauma. Tom bandaged the cuts and sat back, exhausted. Now there was nothing to do but wait and see if Grace's body could recover from the infection, and the treatment both. "Will she live?" Danny asked, staring at his sister's still form. Tom looked at the pale girl lying on the bloody blankets. Her breathing was so faint he could barely see it, and her skin had taken on a grayish color that he recognized as a very bad sign. "I don't know," Tom said honestly. "We've done everything we can. The rest is up to her now." Tom sat beside Grace through the long hours before dawn, monitoring her breathing and checking her pulse. Her fever had broken slightly, but she was still unconscious and very weak. Every few minutes he would place his ear close to her chest to make sure her heart was still beating. Outside the wagon, he could hear the camp stirring as people prepared for another day trapped at Devil's Crossing. The rain had finally stopped, but the damage was already done. The river was higher than anyone had ever seen it, a churning brown torrent that carried whole trees along like twigs. Danny hadn't slept at all. He sat on the other side of his sister, holding her good hand and talking to her in a low voice. "Remember when we were kids, Grace? Remember how you used to tell me stories about brave knights and dragons? You always said the good guys would win if they just didn't give up fighting." Tom found himself listening to the boys' one-sided conversation. It reminded him of his own childhood. Before the war had taught him that good guys didn't always win, that sometimes all the fighting in the world couldn't save the people you loved. As the sun came up, Ruth brought them some weak coffee and cold biscuits. Tom hadn't realized how hungry he was until he smelled the food. He'd been so focused on Grace that he'd forgotten about everything else. "How is she?" Ruth asked, looking down at her daughter. "Stable," Tom said. "The cuts are draining well and her fever's down a little. But she's lost a lot of blood and she's still very weak." Ruth nodded and tried to smile. "But she's alive." "That's something, isn't it?" Before Tom could answer, they heard shouting from outside the wagon. Danny poked his head out to see what was happening. "The river's still rising," Danny reported, "and some of the wagons on the low side of camp are starting to flood." Tom cursed under his breath. They couldn't stay here much longer. If the water kept rising, the entire camp would be underwater by nightfall. But Grace was in no condition to be moved, especially not across a flooded river. A man Tom didn't recognize climbed up to their wagon. He was middle-aged with a thick beard and the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools. "Name's Bill Henderson," the man said. "I'm the wagon master for this train. Heard you're the fellow who came down from the mountain to help this girl." Tom nodded. "That's right." "Well, I appreciate what you're doing," Henderson said. "But we've got a problem. The water's coming up fast and we need to get these wagons across the river before we're all swept away. Can she be moved?" Tom looked at Grace's pale face. Moving her now would be dangerous, but staying might be deadly for everyone in the camp. "She's not strong enough," Tom said finally. "Moving her could kill her." Henderson's face was grim. "I understand that. But if we don't cross soon, we're all going to die. The water's already up to the wagon wheels on the south side." "How long do we have?" Tom asked. "Maybe 2 hours before this whole area's underwater. After that, even if we wanted to stay, we couldn't." Tom felt the familiar weight of an impossible decision. During the war, he'd faced choices like this many times. Save one person or save many. There was never a good answer. "Give me an hour," Tom said. "Let me see if I can get her stable enough to travel." Henderson nodded and climbed down from the wagon. Tom could hear him moving through the camp, organizing people and preparing for the dangerous river crossing. "What are you thinking?" Danny asked. Tom looked at the medical supplies he had left. "Not much. Some laudanum, a little more carbolic acid, and clean bandages. But there might be a way to give Grace enough strength for the crossing. I can give her some laudanum to help with the pain, and use the carbolic acid to clean her wounds one more time. If we wrap her real tight and keep her warm, she might make it across the river." "But it's going to be dangerous. More dangerous than staying here?" Ruth asked, listening to the sound of rushing water outside. "No," Tom admitted. "Staying here would be a death sentence for everyone." He began preparing Grace for the journey, cleaning and rebandaging her wounds while she was still unconscious. The drainage cuts he'd made were healing well, which was a good sign. Her fever was still high, but not as deadly as it had been the night before. As he worked, Tom found himself talking to the unconscious girl. "You've got to hang on just a little longer, Grace. Your brother rode through a mountain storm to find help for you. Your parents have been sitting up all night praying. A lot of people are counting on you to keep fighting." When he was finished, Tom helped Danny and Ruth wrap Grace in dry blankets and prepare her for transport. She stirred once, opening her eyes briefly. "Danny?" she whispered, her voice so weak they could barely hear it. "I'm here, Grace," Danny said, taking her hand. "We're going to get you somewhere safe." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had, then closed her eyes again. Outside, Tom could see the organized chaos of a wagon train preparing for a dangerous crossing. Men were checking wheels and harnesses, making sure loads were secured. Women were packing essential items in waterproof bundles. Children huddled together, sensing the fear of the adults around them. The river itself looked like a living thing, angry and hungry. It had already claimed several trees from the bank, and Tom could see debris spinning in the current, pieces of buildings, fence posts, even what looked like part of another wagon from some less fortunate travelers. Henderson rode up to their wagon on a big bay horse. "We're ready to start crossing. Your wagon will go in the middle of the group, where we can help if something goes wrong." Tom climbed up onto the wagon seat next to Danny's father, who had introduced himself as Robert. Ruth stayed in the back with Grace, ready to keep her daughter stable during the crossing. The first wagon entered the water and Tom held his breath. The current immediately grabbed it, pushing it downstream even as the oxen strained to reach the far bank. For a moment it looked like the wagon might overturn, but the driver kept control and made it across safely. One by one, the other wagons followed. Some made it across without trouble. Others were swept downstream and had to be pulled to safety by riders with ropes. Tom watched it all, calculating their chances. Then it was their turn. Robert urged the oxen into the rushing water, and immediately Tom felt the wagon being pushed sideways by the current. The water was deeper than he'd expected, reaching almost to the wagon bed. "Hold on," Robert shouted as the wagon lurched and tilted. Behind him, Tom could hear Ruth praying and Grace moaning softly as the rough motion jostled her injuries. They were halfway across when disaster struck. One of the oxen lost its footing on the muddy river bottom and went down. The wagon lurched violently to one side and Tom heard Grace cry out in pain. Water began pouring in over the side of the wagon bed. "We're going over," Danny shouted. Tom didn't think. He dove into the back of the wagon just as it tipped completely sideways, throwing everyone into the churning brown water. The current was incredibly strong, pulling him downstream and away from the overturned wagon. Through the muddy water, he could see Grace being swept away from her family, her head barely above the surface. She was too weak to swim, too injured to fight the current that was carrying her toward the rocks downstream. Tom struck out after her, fighting against the river with every bit of strength he had. This was why he'd come down from his mountain, he realized. Not just to treat her wounds, but to save her from drowning in this angry river. Behind him, he could hear Danny screaming his sister's name. Ahead of him, Grace disappeared beneath the surface, pulled down by the weight of her wet clothes and blankets. Tom dove down into the murky water, feeling blindly until his hand closed around cloth. He pulled Grace back to the surface, but she wasn't breathing. The river had filled her lungs with mud and debris. They were being swept toward a fallen tree that stretched across the river like a dam. If they hit it at this speed, the impact would probably kill them both. But it was also their only chance to get out of the current. Tom wrapped his arms around Grace and aimed for a gap in the tree's branches. They hit hard and Tom felt something in his shoulder pop. But he managed to get them both onto the trunk of the fallen tree, out of the rushing water. Grace was completely still, her lips blue with cold. Tom rolled her onto her side and pressed hard on her back, trying to force the water out of her lungs. Nothing happened. He tried again, putting all his weight behind it. Still nothing. Tom looked at this girl he barely knew, this sister that Danny loved so much, this daughter that Ruth and Robert were counting on him to save. She'd survived the infection and the fever and the dangerous treatment. She couldn't die now, not like this. "I didn't ride 2 days to let you die," Tom whispered fiercely, and began pressing on her chest with a rhythm he'd learned during the war. After what felt like forever, Grace suddenly convulsed and coughed up a huge amount of muddy water. Then she took a gasping breath, then another. She was alive. Tom held Grace against his chest as she coughed up more river water, her whole body shaking from cold and shock. They were stranded on the fallen tree trunk in the middle of the raging river, with no clear way to reach either bank safely. "Can you hear me, Grace?" Tom asked, checking her pulse. It was weak but steady. She opened her eyes and looked at him with confusion. Who are you?" "My name's Tom. Your brother Danny brought me to help you." He looked around, trying to figure out how to get them to safety. The tree trunk they were on was thick and stable, but the current rushing around it was still dangerous. From the far bank, Tom could hear voices calling out. Through the spray and mist, he could see people gathering at the water's edge. Someone was waving a rope. Grace, are you all right?" That was Danny's voice, high with fear and hope. Grace tried to sit up, then immediately fell back against Tom with a groan. "Everything hurts," she whispered. "I know," Tom said gently. "You've been very sick and we just took an unexpected swim. But you're alive and that's what matters." A rope landed near them with a splash. Tom looked up to see Jake Morrison on horseback at the river's edge, slowly backing his horse away from the water to keep tension on the line. "Can you hold on to me?" Tom asked Grace. She nodded weakly, wrapping her arms around his neck. Tom tied the rope around both of them, making sure the knots were secure. Getting across the current would be dangerous, but staying on the tree trunk wasn't an option. The river was still rising, and soon the log would be completely underwater. "Hold tight," Tom told Grace. "This is going to be rough." He pushed off from the tree and into the current, letting the rope guide them toward shore while fighting to keep both their heads above water. Grace was dead weight in his arms, too weak to help at all. The current tried to pull them downstream, but Jake's steady horse kept the rope taut. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Tom felt his feet touch the muddy bottom. Hands reached out to pull them from the water. Danny, Robert, Ruth, and several other people from the wagon train. "Is she breathing?" Ruth asked frantically as they laid Grace on the riverbank. "Yes, but she needs to get warm and dry immediately," Tom said. The cold water could kill her just as surely as the infection. They carried Grace to one of the wagons that had made it safely across and wrapped her in every dry blanket they could find. Tom examined her quickly, checking that the river crossing hadn't reopened her wounds or caused new injuries. "The bandages held," Tom reported, "and the cuts are still draining properly. But she's exhausted and half frozen. She needs rest and warmth." Over the next several hours, Tom stayed close to Grace as the wagon train set up a new camp on higher ground. Her fever came and went, sometimes leaving her clear-headed and sometimes sending her back into delirium. But each time she woke up, she seemed a little stronger. "Tell me about the mountain," she said during one of her lucid periods. They were sitting beside a small fire and she was sipping some warm broth that Ruth had made. "What mountain?" Tom asked. "Danny said you live on a mountain all by yourself. Why?" Tom was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "Sometimes it's easier to be alone. People can't disappoint you if you don't let them get close." Grace studied his face in the firelight. "Sounds lonely." "It is," Tom admitted. "But it's safe." "Safe from what?" Tom looked at this young woman who had nearly died twice in the past 2 days, who was asking him honest questions with clear eyes. He found himself wanting to tell her the truth. "From failing people who count on me," he said finally. "During the war, I was a field medic. I tried to save wounded soldiers, but a lot of them died anyway. After a while, it got so I couldn't stand to see people suffer anymore. But you came down from your mountain to help me," Grace pointed out. "Your brother didn't give me much choice. He was pretty determined." Grace smiled slightly. "Danny's like that. Once he makes up his mind about something, he doesn't quit. Takes after our father that way." Over the following days, as the wagon train continued its journey west, Tom found himself spending more and more time talking with Grace as she recovered. She was intelligent and curious, asking him about his experiences in the war, about plants and medicine, about life in the mountains. "You know a lot about healing," she said one afternoon as Tom changed her bandages. "More than most doctors I've met." "I learned by necessity," Tom replied. "When you're in the field and men are dying, you figure out what works and what doesn't pretty quickly. You could help a lot of people with what you know." Tom shook his head. "I tried that once. Didn't work out so well. What happened?" Tom was quiet for a long time, wrestling with memories he usually kept buried. Finally, he told her about Dr. Matthews, the old physician he'd worked with after the war ended. He was getting too old to handle all the calls by himself, so he asked me to help him. I thought maybe I could put what I'd learned to good use, help people instead of just watching them die. "That sounds like a good thing," Grace said. "It was, for a while. We saved a lot of people together. But then there was a fever outbreak, worse than anything I'd seen during the war. Children were dying faster than we could treat them." Tom stopped talking, staring into the distance. Grace waited patiently for him to continue. "There was this little girl, maybe 5 years old. Reminded me of my sister Lucy when she was small. Her parents brought her to us, begging us to save her. I tried everything I knew, but the fever was too strong. She died in my arms while her parents watched. I'm sorry," Grace said softly. "The father blamed me, said I didn't try hard enough, that a real doctor would have saved her." He was probably right. "After that, I couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. Too many people counting on me, trusting me with their lives." Grace was quiet for a moment, then reached out and took his hand. "But you saved me." "Maybe. You're not out of the woods yet." "Yes, I am," Grace said firmly. "I can feel it." "The sickness is leaving me, little by little. My body's getting stronger every day." Tom looked at her objectively with his medic's eye. She was right. Her color was better. Her appetite was returning, and the infection sites were healing cleanly. Against all odds, she was going to make it. "Your family's lucky to have you," Tom said, "and I'm lucky to have them. That's what families do." They take care of each other no matter what. Tom thought about his own family, all gone now except for distant relatives he hadn't spoken to in years. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. "Tom," Grace said, "when we reach Oregon Territory, why don't you come with us? We're going to start a farm, and Danny says there's no doctor for 50 miles around. People are going to need someone like you." Tom shook his head automatically. "I'm not a doctor, Grace. I'm just a man who knows a few things about treating wounds." "You're more than that," she insisted. "You risked your life to save a stranger. You rode through a storm and crossed a flooded river just because a boy asked for your help. That's not something just anyone would do." That night, as Tom sat by the dying campfire listening to the sounds of the sleeping wagon train, he thought about Grace's words. For 5 years he'd hidden in the mountains, avoiding responsibility and human connection. But these past few days had reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, that helping people, even when it was hard and dangerous, gave his life meaning in a way that solitude never could. Maybe it was time to stop running from his past and start building a future. Maybe it was time to find out if Tom the Hermit could become Tom the Healer again. 3 weeks had passed since the river crossing, and the wagon train was finally approaching the end of its long journey. Tom could see the green valley spread out below them, with fertile land stretching as far as the eye could see. This was Oregon Territory, the promised land that had drawn so many families west in search of new beginnings. Grace was walking beside the wagon now, her strength almost completely returned. The infection scars on her arm were fading, and her color was healthy and bright. She'd put on weight during the recovery, and her laugh had come back, a sound that Tom found himself looking forward to hearing each day. "Look at that," Grace said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. "That's going to be our new home." Tom nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. As the wagon train had traveled west, he'd found himself treating more and more people. A broken arm when a child fell from a wagon. A difficult birth when Mrs. Patterson went into labor 2 weeks early. Fever and stomach ailments caused by bad water and trail food. Each time someone came to him for help, Tom had felt the old familiar fear. What if he couldn't save them? What if he made things worse? But each time he'd pushed aside the fear and done what needed to be done, and most of the time people got better. "You've been quiet today," Grace observed. "Something bothering you?" Tom looked at her, this young woman who had become such an important part of his life over the past few weeks. During her recovery, they'd spent countless hours talking about everything: books, philosophy, their dreams for the future. Grace had a quick mind and a gentle heart, and Tom found himself caring about her in a way he hadn't cared about anyone in years. "I've been thinking about what you said," Tom admitted, "about staying here and helping people." Grace's eyes lit up. "And I'm scared," Tom said honestly. "What if I can't live up to what people expect? What if someone dies because I'm not good enough?" Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. "Tom, do you remember what you told me when you pulled me out of that river?" "I said I didn't ride 2 days to let you die." "That's right. You didn't give up on me, even when things looked hopeless. Why do you think other people deserve less than what you gave me?" Tom was quiet, wrestling with the question. During the war and in his work with Dr. Matthews, he'd always focused on the people he couldn't save. He'd let those failures define him, convince him that he wasn't good enough to be trusted with human lives. But Grace was right. He'd saved her when everyone else had given up hope. He'd helped dozens of people during the wagon train journey. Maybe he wasn't perfect, but maybe perfection wasn't the point. "There's something else," Tom said. "Something I haven't told you." Grace waited patiently for him to continue. "Before I came down from the mountain, I'd pretty much decided I was done with living. I wasn't planning to hurt myself or anything like that, but I wasn't really living either. Just existing day by day, waiting for something to happen." Grace's expression grew serious. "What changed?" "You did. Your family did. Seeing how much Danny loved you, how far he was willing to go to save you, it reminded me that life is worth fighting for, that people are worth saving even when it's hard." They resumed walking, following the wagon train down into the valley. Tom could see smoke rising from chimneys in the settlement ahead, and he wondered what kind of people lived there. Were they the kind who would accept a former hermit as their doctor? Would they trust him with their lives and the lives of their children? "Tom," Grace said quietly, "can I tell you something?" "Of course. I almost died in that river. I remember being underwater, feeling the current pulling me down and thinking that this was it. I was going to drown, and there was nothing I could do about it. Tom remembered that moment too. The desperate search through the muddy water, the fear that he might be too late. But then I heard your voice, Grace continued. Even underwater, even half-conscious, I heard you saying that you didn't ride 2 days to let me die. And something about the way you said it. It made me fight harder. It made me want to live. Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion. He'd never known that she'd heard him in that moment. You saved my life twice, Tom. Once with your medicine and once with your determination. But you saved something else too. What's that? You saved my faith in people. You showed me that there are still folks in this world who will risk everything for a stranger, who will keep fighting even when hope is gone. That evening, as the wagon train made camp for what would be their last night together, Tom found himself sitting with the Walsh family around their fire. Ruth was mending clothes, Robert was cleaning his rifle, and Danny was carving a piece of wood into what looked like a horse. So what's it going to be, Tom? Robert asked. You coming with us to start a new life or heading back to your mountain? Tom looked around at these people who had become like family to him. Danny, the brave kid who'd ridden through a storm to find help for his sister. Ruth and Robert, who'd trusted a stranger with their daughter's life. And Grace, who'd shown him that healing others could heal himself too. I've been thinking about that, Tom said. And I realized something. A man can run from his past, but he can't run from who he's supposed to be. And who are you supposed to be? Grace asked softly. Tom looked at her. This remarkable woman who'd survived infection and fever and drowning, who'd fought her way back to life with a determination that inspired everyone around her. I'm supposed to be someone who helps people, Tom said. Someone who doesn't give up when things get difficult. Someone who remembers that every life is worth saving, even when the odds are against you. Danny looked up from his carving with excitement. Does that mean you're staying? Tom nodded. If you'll have me, I'd like to try being your town doctor. I can't promise I'll save everyone, but I can promise I'll never stop trying. Grace smiled, and Tom felt something in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for himself, but for all the people he might be able to help. All the lives he might be able to save. The next morning, as the wagon train rolled into the settlement that would become their new home, Tom made a silent promise to himself and to the memory of everyone he'd failed to save in the past. He would be the kind of doctor he'd always wanted to be, one who never gave up, who fought for every patient as hard as he'd fought to save Grace from that river. He'd ridden 2 days to save a stranger's life, and in the process he'd found his own life again. Now it was time to see what kind of future they could build together in this new land, this place where second chances were possible, and where a man could choose who he wanted to become. As they entered the settlement, Tom could see people coming out of their houses and shops to welcome the new arrivals. Among them would be his future patients, people who would trust him with their most precious possession, their health and their lives. This time, Tom thought, he would be ready for that trust. This time he would be worthy of it. 6 months after arriving in the valley, Tom stood in front of a small wooden building with a freshly painted sign that read, Thomas Mitchell, Medical Practice. The whole town had come together to help him build it, contributing lumber, nails, and labor. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything he needed. A treatment room, a space for medicines, and even a small area where patients could rest if they needed to stay overnight. Grace appeared beside him, carrying a basket of fresh bread from the bakery where she'd found work. Nervous about your first official day as the town doctor? Tom smiled. Terrified would be more accurate. In the months since they'd settled in Pine Valley, as the town was now called, Tom had treated dozens of people informally. Cuts and bruises from farm work, fevers from children, a broken leg when old Pete fell off his roof. But today was different. Today he was officially opening his practice, with real medical equipment that had been shipped from back east and a proper examination table built by the local carpenter. You know what I think about when I get scared? Grace asked. What's that? I think about that night in the wagon when you were working on my arm, cutting out the infection. You could have given up. I was probably going to die anyway, and everyone would have understood if you just made me comfortable and let nature take its course. Tom remembered that night vividly. The smell of infection, the sound of Grace's labored breathing, the weight of her family's desperate hope. But you didn't give up, Grace continued. You kept fighting for me even when it seemed hopeless. And because you did, I'm here today. We're here today." The door of the medical office opened and Danny poked his head out. At 15 now, he'd grown several inches and was helping Tom organize the medical supplies. "There's already someone here to see you, Tom," Danny said. "Mrs. Henderson brought her baby. She says he's been crying all night and won't eat." Tom felt the familiar flutter of nerves in his stomach. What if he couldn't figure out what was wrong? What if he missed something important? Grace seemed to read his thoughts. "You'll be fine," she said quietly. "Trust yourself the way we trust you." Tom nodded and walked into his office. Mrs. Henderson, the wife of the former wagon master, was sitting in a chair holding a small bundle. She looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes. "Dr. Mitchell," she said gratefully. "Thank goodness you're here. Little James has been fussy for 3 days now. He won't nurse and he feels warm to me." Tom washed his hands carefully and then gently examined the baby. The infant was indeed running a fever and his abdomen felt slightly swollen. Tom had seen this condition before, in other babies during the wagon train journey. "He's got colic complicated by a mild fever," Tom diagnosed, "probably from gas trapped in his stomach. It's painful but not dangerous." He prepared a gentle medicine from herbs he'd gathered in the mountains, mixed with a little warm water. "Give him just a few drops of this every few hours. The medicine will help his stomach settle, and the fever should break within a day or 2. Mrs. Henderson's face flooded with relief. "Oh, thank you, doctor. I was so worried." As she left with her baby, Tom felt a familiar warmth in his chest. This was why he'd become a healer in the first place. To ease suffering, to give hope to worried families, to make a difference in people's lives. Over the following weeks, Tom's practice grew steadily. Farmers came to him with injuries from working the land. Children were brought in with the usual childhood ailments. Women sought his help during difficult pregnancies. And slowly, Tom began to realize something important. He was good at this work. Not perfect, but good enough to help most of the people who came to him. One afternoon, Grace stopped by the office to bring him lunch. She found him sitting at his desk writing in a medical journal. "What are you working on?" she asked. "I'm writing down everything I've learned about treating infections," Tom said. "Things I figured out during the war, techniques I used when I treated you, new methods I've discovered since we got here." "That's a wonderful idea. Other doctors could learn from your experience." Tom looked up at her. "That's what I was thinking. Maybe I can send copies to medical schools or to doctors in other frontier towns. Share what I've learned so it can help more people." Grace smiled. The hermit who didn't want to get involved with people's problems is now trying to help doctors he's never even met. "Funny how things change," Tom admitted. As the seasons turned and Pine Valley grew from a small settlement into a proper town, Tom found his role in the community expanding. He served on the town council, helped plan the school, and organized efforts to bring more medical supplies west. But most importantly, he continued to practice medicine with the same determination he'd shown that night when he'd refused to let Grace die. There were failures, of course. An elderly man with heart problems that Tom couldn't fix. A child who died from pneumonia despite all Tom's efforts. Each loss hit him hard, but instead of retreating into isolation, Tom used these experiences to become a better doctor. He read every medical journal he could get his hands on, corresponded with doctors in other cities, and never stopped learning. 2 years after opening his practice, Tom was in his office late one evening when Grace knocked on the door. She'd been quiet lately, and Tom had sensed she had something important to tell him. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Of course. You know you're always welcome here." Grace sat down across from his desk, fidgeting with her hands in a way that wasn't like her usual confident manner. "I've been offered a job," she said finally. "Teaching at the new school they're building in Millfield. It's a good opportunity and they need experienced teachers." Tom felt his heart sink. Millfield was 3 days away by wagon. If Grace took the job, he might only see her a few times a year. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You'd be a great teacher." "I haven't said yes yet," Grace said. "I wanted to talk to you first. Why?" Grace looked at him with those clear, honest eyes that had always seemed to see right through him. "Because over these past 2 years, you've become the most important person in my life. I don't want to leave unless you think it's the right thing to do." Tom felt his heart start beating faster. He'd been in love with Grace for months now, but he'd never said anything. She was young and beautiful and smart, with her whole life ahead of her. What could an old soldier like him offer someone like her? Grace, he said carefully, you shouldn't make decisions about your future based on what I think. You should do what makes you happy. That's just it, Grace said. What makes me happy is being here in Pine Valley, working alongside the man who saved my life and then taught me what it means to truly live. Tom stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. I love you, Tom, Grace said simply. I have for a long time now. And I hope, that maybe you love me too. Tom stood up and walked around the desk to where Grace was sitting. He took her hands in his, these hands that had once been so still and cold when he'd pulled her from the river. I do love you, he said, more than I ever thought possible. But Grace, you're so young and you could have any man you wanted. Are you sure you want to spend your life with a broken-down old soldier? Grace smiled and squeezed his hands. You're not broken down, Tom. You're the strongest, kindest, most courageous man I've ever known. And you're not that old, you're only 35. 36 next month, Tom corrected with a smile. Well then, we'd better get married soon before you're too old to keep up with me. Tom laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Is that a proposal? It is, if you're accepting. Tom pulled Grace to her feet and kissed her, tasting the salt of happy tears on both their faces. 6 months later, on a beautiful spring morning, Tom and Grace were married in the Pine Valley church that the town had finished building, just in time for the ceremony. Danny served as Tom's best man, and Ruth cried tears of joy as she watched her daughter marry the man who had saved her life in so many ways. As they exchanged vows, Tom thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a desperate boy riding through a storm to find help for his dying sister. It had continued with a reluctant hermit who had forgotten how to care about other people. And it had led to this, a new life, a new love, and a new purpose. After the ceremony, as Tom and Grace stood together accepting congratulations from their friends and neighbors, Tom spotted a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd. Jake Morrison, the old trapper who had guided Danny up the mountain that first night, was standing there with a grin on his weathered face. Jake, Tom called out. I didn't know you were coming to the wedding. Jake ambled over and shook Tom's hand. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Besides, I wanted to see how this story turned out. What story? The story that started when a scared kid came looking for help and found a man who'd forgotten how to be human. Looks like it's got a happy ending after all. Tom looked around at the celebration, at Grace laughing with her mother, at Danny showing off his new suit to the other young men, at the townspeople who had become his friends and patients and family. You know what, Jake? Tom said. I think you're right. But it's not really an ending at all. It's more like a beginning. As the sun set over Pine Valley that evening, Tom and Grace stood together outside their new home.